Turkey crisis rattles Asian nations with rising Belt and Road debts. Costly Chinese projects could leave emerging economies with a hangover. Tokyo, Turkey's currency crisis is adding to the financial troubles of emerging Asian economies that have taken big loans for infrastructure projects under China's Belt and Road Initiative. The plummeting lira is forcing Asian nations to consider rate hikes to shore up their currencies. Failure to get back on an even keel could add to heavy debt servicing costs that undermine financial stability. Loans from China help emerging economies pay for the infrastructure improvements they need to foster economic growth, but heavy debt servicing costs threaten to undermine their financial stability. The Center for Global Development, a U.S. think tank, says Laos, the Maldives, Mongolia, Pakistan, and 4 other countries taking part in the Belt and Road Initiative are already at risk. In Mongolia, external debts are now around 8 times the country's foreign exchange reserves. The foreign debts of Laos and Kyrgyzstan exceed 100% of gross domestic product. Highly indebted countries are more vulnerable to a sudden currency depreciation. As their currencies fall in value, it becomes harder for them to pay off their debts, which are typically denominated in dollars. China's growing presence as a global financier has begun to erode the clout of the International Monetary Fund. The IMF has long acted as the lender of last resort for the world. Its policy prescription of bailing out financially troubled countries on condition of fiscal reform, dubbed the Washington Consensus, formed the core of the post-war financial order. It helped damp down the 1994-1995 Mexican currency crisis and the Asian currency crisis of 1997, both triggered by U.S. monetary tightening. But no country is happy to take IMF assistance given out in exchange for strict austerity measures. With China emerging as an alternative lender, some nations are naturally turning their backs on the IMF, even if that means being exposed to unpredictable market forces. Turkey, the epicenter of the current financial turmoil, has steadfastly refused IMF assistance. And Pakistan has been similarly resistant. Pakistan was a frequent recipient of IMF financial lifelines in the past. But the brand new government of Prime Minister Imran Khan, formed after July general elections, is different. Asad Umar, Minister for Finance, in waiting, has told a newspaper that seeking an IMF bailout would be a fallback option only after exploring our preferred options, such as stopgap loans from China. Around the time of the elections, in late July, Pakistan's foreign currency reserves rebounded to $10.3 billion from $9 billion, sparking speculation that China had extended financial assistance. Yet, as the country becomes more dependent on China, fiscal discipline will take a backseat, raising the risk of being overburdened by excessive debt. Pakistan's external debt has risen by 50% over the past 3 years, reaching nearly $100 billion. Around 30% of that is owed to China, and without a bold fiscal reform plan, Pakistan will have less financial room for maneuver over the next 2 years, with its debt servicing costs forecast to rise to nearly 50% of tax revenues, from 30% now. An international finance expert who has worked at the IMF points out that the organization has made the lending framework more flexible. Still, for emerging countries, assistance from China, which proclaims that it does not interfere in domestic affairs, looks more attractive. This means that as long as troubled countries continue to rely on China, their structural problems will not be addressed, and their debt may keep growing. Sri Lanka, facing its own cash squeeze, has handed over the right to manage the port of Hambantota to a Chinese company. If such arrangements become routine, the risk could spread to national security. And there are already signs of that. A high-speed railway being built in Laos, under the Belt and Road Initiative, is estimated to cost $6 billion, or about 40% of the country's GDP. Although China is financing roughly 70% of the cost of the railway, Laos has taken out loans from Chinese banks and other lenders to cover most of its share. Repaying those loans will be a strain on the economy. In Central Asia, Turkmenistan is battling an economic crisis and liquidity crunch brought on by debt payments to China. Nearby Tajikistan has sold the right to develop a gold mine to a Chinese company in lieu of repaying loans. The IMF has traditionally been the lender of last resort to financially troubled countries. In exchange, the fund typically demands that they get their fiscal house in order by cutting spending or raising taxes. China's willingness to provide loans may offer debtors a temporary reprieve from such strictures, but at the cost of their long-term financial and economic health. Macro Digest, it's not Turkey, it's the debt cycle. There is currently a lot of focus on Turkey, and for good reason, but Turkey is really only a second or third derivative of a global macro story. Turkey represents the catalyst for a new theme, which is too much debt and current account deficits equals crisis. In that sense, we have come full cycle from deficits and debt mattering in the 1980s and 90s, but not in the 00s and 10s post the Nasdaq crash and great financial crisis, under the biggest monetary experiment of all time. In our view, the order of sequence for this crisis is as follows. 1. The debt cycle is on pause as first China and now the US have deleveraged and normalized. 2. The stock of credit or the credit cake has collapsed. First it was the change of credit or the credit impulse which tanked in late 2017 and into 2018. Now it is also the stock of credit. Right now, global M2 over global growth is less than 1, meaning the world is trying to achieve 6% global growth with less than 2.5% growth in its monetary base, the exact opposite of the 00s and 10 central bank and politician-driven model. 3. This smaller credit cake is spilling over to a stronger USD, as US growth increases versus the rest of the world, and a higher marginal cost of funding, as the amount of dollars available in the credit system shrinks, leading to a mini-emerging market crisis. 4. Finally, the Turkish situation was really created by the aforementioned factors, but it was made worse by President Erdogan's autocratic and naive monetary and fiscal response. The reason this mini-crisis is not idiosyncratic is points 1 through 3, but the market is still treating Turkey as the starting point of the current mini-crisis. Where do we go from here? More and more investors seem to believe that we are on the brink of an Asian crisis 2.0, or a liquidity crisis. I no longer think that there are really any preordained paths or predestined scenarios for all of this, but my forecast would be 1. A 25% chance of a Turkish default within 12 months. Erdogan is not following the 3 standard responses to a funding crisis: an aggressive monetary and fiscal response, seeking help from outside, read European Union or International Monetary Fund, and or creating a currency board closing convertibility of TRY. The present approach contains none of these elements, which could lead to further escalation and an overall M crisis. 2. A 25% chance a strong reversal of quantitative tightening from the Federal Reserve, supported by the European Central Bank and major central banks. The timing here could be around the Jackson Hole event at the end of August. Overall, U.S. monetary policy and growth have peaked, and the mini-crisis together with the Trump administration's trade tariffs is creating a need to first pause and then reverse policy lower. The world is almost coming to a standstill, after all, from the Fed's extremely hollow tightening. 3. A 25% chance that China comes to the rescue in a fashion similar to 2007/08. China is now asynchronically easing both monetary policy and fiscal policy, as growth is not only undershooting targets, but doing so significantly. To me, the recent technology sector's sell-off is a sign that the lows could be coming in soon. The Chinese rescue scenario could also be called another delay, or yet more pretend and extend, but the data and research I am seeing from China, plus the research I have published, points to a country that is acutely aware of the risks posed by growth shortfalls based on too much deleveraging relative to the country's position in its overall economic transformation. China 2025. Be aware that the potential potency of Chinese stimulus is now much smaller than it was last time, as the country debt is higher, productivity remains low, and global transmission is clogged. 4. A 23% chance that global recession, based on points 1 through 3, arrives by Q4 18 or Q1 19. This recession would spring from the enormous underestimation of the damage done to SMEs and MMEs by tariffs, a rising marginal cost of capital, and a USD that is too strong for the world's indebted markets. 5. A 2% chance that the world recovers, with this event coming to be seen as a mere blip on the radar. In this scenario, the U.S. economy is strong enough to carry the rest of the world. Italy sees 3% growth, and the EU solves Brexit. Remember, Nothing is impossible. Market views U.S. markets are 3 standard deviations more expensive than the MSCI World Index. I repeat, 3, based on a 24-month look backwards.